Hello, everyone. I'd like to continue with our discussions of some of these two-dimensional design concepts, and we're going to talk about composition a bit here today. And if you recall from the last video, we talked about balance, right? Symmetrical balance, asymmetrical balance, and radial balance. And these are essentially elements of composition, right? Again, if we think about what composition means, we're talking about how is this image composed or how is this image arranged? And I think it's interesting and important to see some of these ways that we do arrange images, right? So we have the Fibonacci sequence right here, and this will relate to the golden ratio, which I'll talk about next, which that will relate to how we go about structuring and building compositions, or some of the ways we can structure and build compositions. So if you've never seen the Fibonacci sequence before, here it is. Here's a little infographic on the Fibonacci sequence. So he was an Italian mathematician that figured out this pattern of numbers, right? Where every number is the sum of the two numbers preceding it. So we can see the 1 to 2 to 3 to 5 to 8 and so on. And when you put this down in a graph format, I forgot this animates. So when you put this down in the graph format, you get the Fibonacci sequence here. Now, the Fibonacci sequence is interesting because it also fits inside the golden ratio. Now this is important here, and this is something that you should know when it comes to arranging any two-dimensional image, but we use this golden ratio, and we've noticed this golden ratio both in nature and in human history, if we look back at architecture. So we essentially have a square, and if this square is equidistant, so we have a ratio of 1 to 1, right? It's a perfect square. If we then take an addition onto that to make a rectangle, where that total length of the two shapes equals 1.6, right? So we have 1 by 1.6. This relationship here is called the golden ratio or golden rectangle. Now, the Fibonacci sequence very nicely fits right into this, right? We can see how the spiral would go into the golden ratio, and each one of these subsequent smaller squares that's being made by the Fibonacci sequence are the same ratios, right? It's not the same distance as the other, but here we have the same ratio of 1 to 1 on that square in the upper right-hand corner. That bottom right-hand square, we have a ratio of 1 to 1, and so forth. So I bring this up because I want us to start thinking about how images, and here we see an example, we see how the Fibonacci sequence has been applied also in nature. Here we can see the nautical shell probably being the most common way of seeing the Fibonacci sequence, but right, if you think about the eye of a hurricane and the spirals of galaxies, it's the same relationship. So here are some more examples. The golden ratio. We can see this structure. Now I bring this up as a way to kind of segue into some compositional techniques and things that as two-dimensional designers and artists and illustrators, this is just something that I feel we should be familiar with. Now, if we look at this image here, we're going to talk about the rule of thirds. Some of you, I'm sure, probably already know what this is, but for those of you who don't, if you notice this image here, holds pretty close to that 1 by 1 by 6. If you think about, the rectangular landscape standard that we always see, if we imagine it to be a 1 by 1 by 6, and then if we place a grid of sorts, it breaks the image up into 9 golden ratios. And when we have objects that are on or close to these horizon lines and vertical axes, we get images that are more successful than others, right? If we think back to the balance video that we had not too long ago, that we can see that these images are not balanced, but again, they make more interesting images. were this tree to be placed in the direct center, right, there's something about that placement that's unappealing to us, more so than placing it on one of these vertical axes. So here we can see again, we see the rule of thirds. Now that the bottom portion that the bottle is sitting on doesn't exactly line up with that bottom horizon line, but the top one more or less does, kind of close to in the distance, right? We can see where the water line is meeting the mountains in the distance. That's close. And also take note on those intersection points, right? Where we have those perpendicular angles. We have the 1, 2, 3, 4 intersections. These tend to be places that are more successful than others when we're placing objects within a composition. So here we have the same image, but one with the grid overlay and one without it. We can see that that elk is looking to the left, right? This would be a different image if the elk was looking to the right, right? So consider that as well too, the direction of your subject and which way their space is opening up. So here the space is opening up to the left. And again, recall that fulcrum idea, right? So we have that fulcrum in the middle, and is this image balanced? Well, no, not necessarily, but images don't have to be balanced. That's just more something for you to think about and have the language to discuss when it comes to your own images. But we can see the rule of thirds quite clearly here. We can see that elk is placed right in that intersection of the horizontal and the vertical in the bottom right-hand corner. The hay line, right, meets that horizontal, and nothing really on that top horizontal, but we can see that the rest of the image fits quite nicely. If you think about portrait photography, this is another way that we can structure an image. Here we have the rule of thirds, and you know, she seems to be, right, she's off-centered to the left-hand side, but I don't know, had I done this image, I think putting her on the right vertical axis may have been maybe a stronger composition, opening up to the left-hand side versus all that negative space on the right side. But many of these compositional rules are made to be broken, and doesn't necessarily mean that you should be following these rules. There are some standards. So I mean, here is another example. This is quite clearly a rule of thirds image. But I want you to think about this. Would this image be more or less successful with different placements of the figure? For example, if she were dead center in this image, how would the image change, right? And then here, a few examples. And again, those 4 intersection points tend to be stronger areas than others when placing objects. Here we can see, yeah, the rule of thirds in that cup. So the rule of thirds is one way that you can go about structuring an image, but it's not the only way. There's many different ways. And diagonals can be another successful way of structuring an image, right? So diagonals tend to create movement, right? Your eye hits the image and then moves around the diagonal to make for some dynamic and interesting compositions. So here we can see, right? Again, think about balance here. Is this image balanced? I would say this is quite strongly balanced, but we see the strong triangle, the strong diagonals that force our eyes upward. Here's another diagonally based composition. And there's a lot of different diagrams and little graphs that we could go by, but I don't want to go in too much into them, but I will show some of them. So here we have a diagonal connecting the top left and the bottom right, and then we have 90-degree angles that are shooting off from that blue line into the corners. So the red lines are parallel to each other, and that blue line goes from corner to corner. And again, think about that fulcrum idea again, right? That seesaw. If you had an image that had components that were structured in the picture plane like we see, then it might be safe to say that that image would be balanced. But this can get pretty crazy. If we think about the Fibonacci sequence again and we place circles inside of those squares and we start connecting 45-degree angles into the corners, and we can see that we get a lot of different places that we could have focal areas, right? That 13, for example, would become a focal point, right? The intersection of the green line on the 5 and the 8 would become a focal point. And this can get really complicated, and I don't advise trying to structure your images with all of these pre-arranged ideas of composition. I'm more just showing you them as a way for you to understand that these are things to consider when making or looking at objects, but it can get pretty crazy. So here we see lots of diagonals working, right? We can see a focal point of her head, but the two of them together there. And just for the sake of it, again, we're putting that fulcrum right in the middle, and we want to see, is this image balanced or not? I would say it's pretty close, maybe a bit heavier on the right-hand side. Here are more examples of diagonals. So if I asked you where the focal point is, I'm sure we would all say the bride, right? We can see those lattices on top of the boat are all directly pointing towards her, but creating diagonals as well. There you go. Some more diagonals here. So quite strong, quite strong focal area here of the figure. But then we have the intersection of the railroad and the shadow there. So together with balance and composition, I want you to be thinking about these things in the next project when you're going to be taking your own photographs and trying to apply some of these compositional rules to your own photographs.